Article 1, Sections 1 through 7 about the legislative branch. What the Constitution states about the Senate and House of Representatives. Presented by Rahul Ran Fassel and one of the greatest artists of all time, Lily Yuan. So why wait? Let's get started on this magnificent and patriotic Constitution. As we know, the two largest legislative branches of the government are the Senate and the House of Representatives. Let's start with the House of Representatives. The term for an individual elected to the House of Representatives back then is the same as right now. Members of the House of Representatives term lasts 2 years. Doesn't seem like a lot of time, but because of how much could change in 2 years, each and every House representative has a very important role in the Congress. But with a 2-year term comes various requirements that the person has to meet to even run for the position in the first place. There are 3 main requirements. Firstly, the person has to be at least 25 years old. Very surprising, huh? You can be a member of the Congress as young as 25 years old. That is incredible how much impact you can make on this country from a young age. Another requirement is that the person who should be a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years prior to running for their position. 7 years is oddly specific, but it is a key requirement that the Founding Fathers have placed. The third and most important requirement is that the Constitution describes it as a representative, quote, who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of the state in which he shall be chosen, end quote. In other words, the representative cannot move away from his state after he is chosen for a specific state. He still needs to live in his state that he represents until his term ends. Now that we know who can run for these positions, let's answer the question of who can vote. The original Constitution stated that representatives are chosen by the number of, quote, free persons, even the people who are running for the position. Everyone else, such as slaves, are counted as 3/5 of a person. Indians who are not taxed do not count as a person. Unfair? Yes, it is. However, we need to consider what the times were back then before quickly saying that the Founding Fathers were horrible for not saying that everyone is equal. There's one important aspect in the Constitution, which is the enumeration. The Constitution states that, quote, the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall be by law direct, end quote, located in Section 2, Clause 3. The enumeration is referring to accounting a specific people in a specific area. It is important to note that the Congress was not allowed to talk about how things were counted. Enumeration decided how many seats each state was able to elect. The original Constitution stated that, quote, the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative, end quote. The Constitution also states that, quote, until such enumeration shall be made, the state of New Hampshire shall be entitled to choose 3, Massachusetts 8, Rhode Island Province Plantations 1, Connecticut 5, New York 6, New Jersey 4, Pennsylvania 8, Delaware 1, Maryland 6, Virginia 10, North Carolina 5, South Carolina 5, and Georgia 3. But we can see now that many of the numbers for each state increased since the Constitution was written. The House of Representatives did not have any specific total number of seats they should have. We should see this is the reason because the enumeration could change the number of seats depending on the population of the state. Again, the Constitution does state, quote, the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000 people, but each state shall have at least 1 representative, end quote. So if the population increases, the number of representatives of each state can increase too. To give you guys a little bit more glimpse of the numbers, right now in the modern day, California is one of the most representative states in the United States, and it is by far one of the most populous states. The House of Representatives have 53 seats reserved for Californians. If we compare California now to the rules of the Constitution back then, California has about 37 million people, and if we divide that by 30,000, we will find that about 1,250 representatives would be allowed. This is a lot. But if we take a look at Wyoming, today Wyoming only has 1 representative. However, if we use the rules back then, Wyoming has about 560,000 people, meaning that the Constitution would have allowed 19 representatives, the original Constitution. 19 to the 1,200 of California, that is a big difference. Now, moving on, say that an elected member of the House were to die in the office. What would happen? This is a rare case in the modern days, but it is possible. For example, very recently, a person named David Ondal, who was running for the House representing North Dakota, died 1 month before the election due to COVID-19. But surprisingly enough, he's projected to win one of the 2 seats that are reserved for North Dakota. So this type of scenario occurs even nowadays, and it is important to know what happens. Well, according to the original text of the Constitution, quote, when vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies, end quote. In other words, when a House of Representatives dies, an executive authority of the representative states can possibly start a new election to find someone to fill the place.
Good morning, everybody. This is Renata Harback with the second section of our presentation. Right about now, you might be wondering why there's a giant baby on your screen. Yeah, alright. Well, like for the House of Representatives, there are restrictions on who can run for the Senate. According to the original text of the Constitution, all potential candidates for the Senate must be at least 30 years old, a 9-year citizen of the U.S., and must reside in the state that they are chosen to represent. So both the requirements for the House of Representatives, which Rahul talked about earlier, and the Senate discussed this idea of citizenship, which at the time when the Constitution was written was very loosely defined. So the original form of the Constitution did not have specific guidelines for what a person must do in order to qualify as a U.S. citizen, other than simply reside within the states. For this reason, things were later specified in an amendment that was made to the Constitution, namely the 14th Amendment, which states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And there is our citizen all grown up. Yeah, okay. Although there is some ambiguity surrounding certain sections of the Constitution, a lot of the systems put in place at the time in which the Constitution was written are still present and relevant today. For example, the organization of the Senate and the roles of both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So as we've learned from past readings, senators serve 6-year terms, but the way in which elections within the Senate are held is very specific and a little confusing, to be honest with you. Changes to the Senate, which is composed of 2 senators from each state, are made every 2 years. Senators are divided into 3 classes, with no 2 senators from the same state residing at the same class at the same time. And the elections of senators by state governments are held so that only one class, which is a third of the senators overall, is altered biennially. Biennially. Every 2 years. This system of staggering elections was meant to regulate the stability of the Senate and prevent the complete turnovers that might occur if the entire Senate was replaced every 6 years, as well as the corruption that might happen if a collective group of senators remained unchecked for too long. So for many of the same reasons, this system is still used today. Another example of a constitutional system that is still in place today is the presidential impeachment process. Yes, all right, very, very relevant. For this, duties are divided among the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the House of Representatives is responsible for initiating the impeachment process. They are said to have, quote unquote, the sole power of impeachment. And this is true, but also misleading in a way. The House of Representatives does not actually have the power to remove a president from office. That's the job of the Senate. So this is why the Senate is said to have, again, quote unquote, sole power to try all impeachments. So the Senate is responsible for putting the president on trial to decide if they are guilty of committing a crime. The main difference between these 2 processes is that the Senate decides whether or not there are actual consequences for the president. In this way, the powers are more or less balanced. They follow through to follow through with the impeachment process. Both groups are necessary, and again, this system is still in use today. Okay, and that's it for me. Thank you all. All right, bye.
So, representatives are elected to the House of Representatives and senators to the Senate. But who decides the actual election process for senators and representatives? Well, the states do. The Constitution gives the states the responsibility of deciding when, where, and how elections are held for their senators and representatives. But Big Daddy Congress can always step in and change the time and method of the elections. This is to prevent the states from getting any funny ideas about undermining federal authority by, say, holding unfair elections or just not holding elections. The one thing that Congress cannot change is the place in which these elections are held. This is likely to prevent the Congress from, say, holding all the elections in Washington, or if we get crazy, Antarctica. This is why we need checks and balances, people. Now, even though they're the Congress, they can't completely laze about. The Constitution requires them to meet at least once a year on the first Monday of December, although they can change it to a different, perhaps warmer day. Just because the state elects someone to Congress does not mean that their place in Congress is set in stone. The Constitution gives each house the power to judge the elections of their members. In many cases, a losing candidate to a seat has appealed to Congress for a legislative recount, where Congress will reevaluate the results of the election. Even once a member of Congress has been approved for a seat, they can still be voted out if 2/3 of the relevant house agrees to it. Whew. So what are the rules for how each House of Congress runs its affairs? Well, there must be a majority of its members present before a House of Representatives can actually hold proceedings. And, maybe they can actually get some stuff done. They also need a journal in which they will record all of their proceedings. These journals should be made public from time to time. However, the Congress can decide to keep a part of the journal private. This is to safeguard against, other nations or poor people. Lastly, the Constitution mandates that when Congress is holding its proceedings, one house cannot just refuse to show up at a different spot or show up at a different spot to unfairly thwart the agenda of the other house. However, aside from these rules, the houses are given a great deal of autonomy in order to run their own affairs. Guys, it pays to be in Congress. The Constitution mandates that members of Congress be paid a salary out of the federal treasury. This is an important difference from the Articles of Confederation, where they would be paid out of the respective state's treasury. It emphasized that members of Congress were loyal to the nation before the states. Members of Congress are also mostly immune to arrest or question during the session of Congress. This is to prevent their freedom of speech or debate from being unfairly inhibited during the proceedings. But an important restriction put on members of Congress is that they cannot hold any government positions outside of their congressional house. This is to help isolate and weaken the power of the legislative body. Lastly, the framers of the Constitution made sure to state that the House of Representatives, as opposed to the Senate, holds the sole power of changing the taxation of the people. This is so no person could claim that the government has taxation without representation. However, the Senate, who are elected not by the people of their state, but by the government of the state, can always block the changes proposed by the House. Lastly, it's time for veto wars. If the Congress wants to pass a bill, it is first presented to the President before it can be made a law, who can then veto it. If the President doesn't veto in 10 days, then it is too late and it becomes a law, unless the Congress decides to take it back. If the President does veto a law, then it is sent back to Congress with feedback, which the Congress will then take into account. But 2/3 of the Congress can then veto the President's veto. But the veto power of the President is then expanded to include essentially anything that involves the Senate and the House working together. This serves as a check on the power of Congress, and as it impedes the Houses working together in unison to subvert the power of government.